Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civ 1. Today, we're going to be looking at the 3rd century crisis, which lasts roughly from 235 AD until 284 AD. And our focus question is going to be name and explain at least 4 reasons for the decline of the Roman Empire during the 3rd century crisis. So grab a pen and paper, a notepad or tablet, and let's begin. And just one caveat here. When I say name and explain, I don't mean to just list them. I mean that you should be explaining them and, if at all possible, trying to connect them together. Okay, with that out of the way, let's look at this period of time. Now, the last time we talked about the Pax Romana, this time of peace following the period of Augustus. And really the high point of that high point was this period of time from about 96 to 180 AD, when you had a succession of good emperors known as the 5 good emperors. And it's during this time that Rome had its greatest amount of prosperity. Its borders reached its maximum extent. All of these individuals followed Augustus's policies of adopting a successor. All right, so none of them had a natural-born heir of their own, except the last one, Marcus Aurelius, who we'll talk about. But everybody else adopted somebody, and they did a good job. They adopted qualified candidates. And the other important thing about these emperors is they also followed Augustus in working closely with the Senate. All right, so they weren't authoritarians for the most part. They wanted the Senate there. They felt that the Senate gave their administrations a veneer of legitimacy, right? So, Rome had this tradition of being a republic, and as long as the Senate was there and the Senate was condoning their behavior, things looked good. Okay. Well, things come to a rather bad halt in 180 AD, and this is the time when Marcus Aurelius, maybe the greatest of Roman emperors, is a philosopher, a Stoic philosopher, a really selfless individual. Marcus Aurelius died, but Marcus Aurelius, unlike the others, had a son, and so he passed it on to his son, Commodus. And Commodus was a real nut job. A megalomaniac. And is in many ways very much the opposite of his father, who was kind of selfless and dedicated to the empire. Commodus was the opposite, which was something the Senate had long feared, is having a prince assume the throne, right? Someone who's been born with power. Usually that goes to their head. They didn't have to work their way up. They were just always wore the purple, right? Well, anyways, Commodus soon went crazy and believed that he was the reincarnation of Hercules. You can see him dressed here in this statue in a traditional Herculean sort of attire with the lion skin head and the club. But it got worse than that. Commodus decided he wanted to be a gladiator, which was scandalous back then because gladiators were slaves, but you couldn't talk him out of it, and so he began to train with gladiators. And, well, he never lost a fight, but they weren't always fair fights because, well, one, do you really want to strike the emperor? And two, oftentimes he had his opponents fight him with a weighted sword. But it got worse. Commodus also liked to pretend he was a giant. And so he would gather up midgets and people without legs and bash their heads in like he was a giant of some sort. I told you he was a nutter for sure. He also liked to slaughter exotic animals in the Colosseum. Supposedly on one occasion, with his bow and arrow, he killed 100 lions and other wild beasts. So definitely a weirdo. And he had very poor relations with the Senate. He tended to disdain them, and the feeling was mutual. And finally, he was murdered in 192. Just too crazy. Now, hopefully things get better, but they don't. Because, well, this set off the year 193 is the year of the 5 emperors. The Senate wanted to have some normalcy back, and so they elevated one of their own, a man by the name of Pertinax. The problem with Pertinax was, he was fiscally responsible. He saw that Commodus had just blown up the budget, and he decided he was going to cut back on expenditures, and this meant not paying his personal bodyguard, the Praetorian Guard, their expected donatives. It was common for an emperor to pay these guys off as a gesture of goodwill when they became emperor, but Pertinax, he thought it was fiscally unresponsible, and his bodyguards were furious, and they murdered him. And then they said, we need a new emperor, and we'll hold it out to the highest bidder. Whoever will pay us the most money, we'll use our muscle to make sure he's elevated emperor. And so another senator, Didius Julianus, raised together some funds and a huge amount of money, and he gave it to the Praetorians, and they elevated him as the new emperor. Well, even though Rome was pretty corrupt, this just seemed like too much to, buy your way into the emperorship. And it certainly didn't sit well with some of these powerful governors who were in the empire and who had large armies. And so at the same time, 3 governors, Pescennius Niger, Claudius Albinus, and Septimius Severus, all had their troops declare them emperor. All right? And so now you have 4 people all claiming to be emperor. It's a bad situation. And if you look here, Pertinax is over here in Italy. I'm sorry, Pertinax is dead. Julianus is in Italy. Over here in an area called Pannonia, which is in the Balkans, you had Severus. Out here in Syria, you had Niger. And out here you have your last contender, Albinus in Britain. Now, I don't want you to get too bogged down in the details, because the details themselves aren't really important. I'll explain why I'm going into this much detail in a second. But anyways, Severus was in the best position to march his army on Rome. He quickly did. He swept out the Praetorians, those bodyguards, those corrupt bodyguards, and he had Julianus murdered and himself declared emperor. But things weren't going to go so well, because Niger was hot on his heels, crossing over, and he was going to make a play for it. And let's not forget about Albinus up here in Britain. And our friend Severus decided that, he didn't want to fight 2 armies at once, and so he talked Albinus into just holding still and made him some promises. He was able to defeat Niger, and then he turned on his ally Albinus, and instituted the Severan dynasty. Well, why did I go through all that trouble of talking about this incident with the 5 emperors? Well, the reason is, and I want you to understand this, is that in many ways, the incidents in the year 193 were unusual, but they were a precursor of what was to happen. Okay? You had senators who wanted to declare members of the Senate as the next emperor. You had assassinations. You had rival generals going at each other's throats. And in many ways, this scenario was going to be played out time and time again in the 3rd century. The days of working closely with the Senate and the days of peace and orderly transition, well, those largely came to an end. Now, the Severan dynasty ruled for, about 40 years. And in many ways, they marked a new phase in Roman history. Any notion that once he became emperor, that Severus was going to work closely with the Senate were soon dispelled. Being a military man, he had pretty much disdain for the Senate and tended to ignore them. And the events that had just transpired kind of proved that the Senate didn't have any real power. They didn't have armies. Some of the good emperors wanted to give them the appearance of power, but really, what could the Senate do? They were very limited. And the fact that the last 3 emperors had been murdered within a year's time, well, that didn't bode well. And so the Severan dynasty tended to amplify the army at the expense of the Senate. They relied heavily on the army. And so, under the Severans, the army was given all kinds of privileges. Severus knew that the only reason he had become emperor was because the army had backed him and had been loyal to him. And so, he made some changes. One of the changes that he made is he allowed the army to marry. Prior to this time, you had to wait till you were out of the service to marry. But many soldiers wanted to take wives, and he wanted to keep his soldiers happy. You may say, well, okay, well, good. Now they're married men. Big deal. Well, what this tended to do is it tended to attach soldiers to one area. The area that they were serving in, because now they had wives, they had children there. Increasingly, soldiers are recruited from the same area, and this begins to cause a problem. And I don't know if you can imagine what kind of problem this is, but really what it makes is soldiers who are unwilling to leave the area that they're stationed at. Previously, soldiers had been sent all over the empire, they had been mixed up, but increasingly soldiers identify with Syria or Britain or Gaul or wherever they happen to be stationed. And so you get kind of like regional attachments, which was ultimately bad for the empire to have different regions and the armed forces loyal to that region and not the empire. The other thing, he saw what had happened to some of the other emperors who hadn't paid off their soldiers. And so Severus opened up the bank accounts, and he gave all the soldiers in the empire a 50% raise. Obviously, he wanted them loyal to him and not to anybody else. And that was a lot of money. The soldiers also, he also needed to secure the loyalty, and this was going to be a serious problem because when the next emperor comes, well, they expect the same thing and maybe more. All right. And so keeping the soldiers who are no longer quite as loyal because they should be loyal, they're now more loyal, well, because, well, who's paying more? All right. In order to finance this, Severus also had to inflate the currency and make all kinds of confiscations. Basically, a lot of the senators who he didn't like or suspected of treason, well, he had them murdered and took their wealth from them. And in many ways, the Severus's philosophy can be summed up with what he told his two sons on his deathbed. He said, quote, "Be good to one another, enrich the soldiers, and damn the rest." All right, end quote. So that was his philosophy on things, and his sons definitely took that to heart. All right. Well, the Severan dynasty lasted 235 when, well, surprise, surprise, the last of the Severan emperors was murdered. And this sent in a new phase called the barracks emperors. Barracks because these were exclusively military men. All right. And the barracks emperors continued a lot of the same policies as the Severans, but even more so. They were kind of like the Severans on steroids. Most of them had very little connection to Rome. Many of them had grown up in the provinces as soldiers. Many of them were from the lower orders of society, and their only claim to fame was they had risen through the ranks, and they were powerful military men. And so, like the Severans, they broke the budget paying for their soldiers and keeping them happy. Confiscations of civilian property increased. And they leaned heavily even on cities to finance making demands that they be financed. And so they weren't particularly popular with the civilian population, but, well, what are you really going to do? And under the barracks emperors, the army got even more unruly. There was really a lack of discipline. Their loyalty was more to their unit than it was to the empire. Regionalism increased. The soldiers from one part of the empire didn't necessarily like the soldiers from the other part of the empire. And increasingly, the soldiers became like a separate caste. It was common at this point in the empire for fathers and sons, for sons of soldiers to become soldiers themselves. Many of these kids grew up their whole lives in the army barracks. They had very little connection or sympathy with the civilian population. And so this really, maybe made them a little more brutal toward the civilians. Well, this period was pretty disastrous for Rome, the era of the barracks emperors. And this was really the low point of the 3rd century crisis. Because, as I said, disloyal soldiers, well, what's to stop them from turning on emperors or their commanders? And this happened frequently. Between the years 235 and 280 AD, which is a 50-year period, there were 20 legitimate emperors and countless usurpers. All kinds of people were claiming to be emperors at the head of an army that would try to take them from Rome. There were massive assassinations. And so during this period of time, one of the most dangerous jobs to be was the emperor, because if you do the math, most of the emperors during this period of time only served for about 30 months, 2.5 years, before being assassinated. And only 2 of these emperors died of natural deaths. All the rest were either killed in battle or assassinated. So a very turbulent time, and as you can imagine, each time one of these new guys comes, they've got to pay off their soldiers. There's all sorts of armies fighting across the countryside. Rome was a pretty chaotic, disorganized, and frequently in civil strife during this period. But it gets worse. The era of this particular period of time is sometimes referred to by bioarchaeologists as a period of time when we now know that the climate was cooling. All right? They know this by looking at ice core samples, tree samples, marine deposit, cave minerals. People who are smarter than me and who study the history of climate have recognized that this was a period of cooling. The time of the Pax Romana, which is in this yellow period of here, was a relatively warm period of time. Warm, wet, and generally favorable toward crops. But it was volcanic activity and several other natural factors caused the climate to decline. And as we hear on the news all the time, these things can have, even a few degrees can have drastic impacts on people's lives, especially when you're an agricultural society like the Romans were. All right? And one of the things that happened is the weather got colder and drier. And so this meant that the plants were receiving less light. More of them were dying because of cold conditions or because of drought. And what we really see is the Roman population, and there's evidence that agricultural yields began to drop. More people were malnourished. And this is adding to all the political problems. Well, as the climate cooled and got worse, and the population became colder and hungrier, this caused malnutrition and opened the Romans up to plague. Now, it wasn't just the cold weather that caused this. It was the fact that Rome had been so successful. I talked about this gigantic network of trade that existed. Rome was now connected to India and China. More Romans were living in cities. And silk and spices may have come across the Silk Road, but so did pathogens. And so beginning in the 160s and recurring again in the 240s, Rome was struck by some major plagues. Now, they were what we would call a virgin population. They didn't have immunity to what scientists now believe was the first outbreak of smallpox. And all kinds of contemporary accounts tell us that people were dying in the streets, that maybe 10% of the population died in these plagues. Alexandria supposedly was losing 5,000 people a day. And it was generally pretty devastating for the Roman population that was already suffering under some of the hardship that we've already mentioned. Another phenomenon of the 3rd century, and probably related to the other two, is agricultural decline. Okay? The Romans noted what they call agri deserti, or deserted fields. Now, there's all kinds of, we don't know exactly why so many Romans were abandoning their fields. The most likely candidates are plague. Just people had died and they couldn't work the fields anymore. Warfare, some people were probably driven away because of all the violence and warfare happening. Other people point to soil exhaustion. You know, the Romans had been so successful and they had grown so much, perhaps the soil was exhausted. But it was a major problem, and the Romans tried very hard to get new people onto the farms because it was devastating. All right? There's less food coming into the cities because there's less people working the fields. This exacerbates the starvation problems that they're already having. And most importantly, from the Roman government's perspective, this was less tax revenue. Obviously, if people aren't working on their lands, they can't pay taxes. And so the Romans were really at a loss as they started to see their economy begin to shrink and to decline. And this led to our final point, monetary crisis. And again, there's less taxpayers. There's evidence that the Roman silver mines in Spain, where they got much of their silver, was declining, and there was less silver to be had. There was increasing expenditures. Each Roman emperor had to pay and give raises to his soldiers, and so there was just less and less silver around. And so they began to debase the currency. In other words, rather than making it nearly pure silver like it was in the first century, they began to debase it with metals like copper. And so the amount of the amount of silver in the coin dropped from nearly 100% during the first century till, about 2%. And as many of you know, when you start to do that, the coins become more worthless. And, well, at the making of this video, we're in an inflation crisis ourselves. And so many people may have noticed that things start to get expensive. And so the price of wheat, which was the staple of the Roman diet, went from half a denarius, that was the Roman unit of currency, to 300 by the 3rd century. In other words, instead of coming with half a coin, you needed to come to the market with a gigantic bag of coins in order to buy the day's bread. And this caused all kinds of trouble as the economy suffered as a result of this. Many people stopped accepting Roman money and returned to barter, and caused all kinds of trouble for the Roman economy, which was already reeling. But it gets worse. One of the things that had enabled the Pax Romana was the fact that Rome had largely defeated all its enemies. But that was about to change. And change started a long, long way from Rome. Out here is Central Asia. And these were many of the trade routes that connected Rome to China and India passed through. It was a land of steppe, which is kind of like plains or grasslands, inhabited by nomads who often were involved in carrying trade from China to Rome. Well, in the course of this trade that was increasingly booming, these nomads got more sophisticated, and they adopted some of the weapons of the Chinese and the Romans. They became rich and they became powerful, and soon they began to threaten these older civilizations. And so at the same time Rome began to face pressure from barbarians, so did the Chinese. And the most fierce of these steppe warriors during this period of time were a group of people called the Huns, who began to march from Central Asia and into Eastern Europe. Now, they weren't in the Roman Empire yet, but they were pressing on the neighbors of the Romans. And the Huns were a pretty fierce people. They rode these horses. They were excellent bowmen. They were very difficult to chase because if you're on foot, obviously you can't catch a horse. They would disappear. They would come back. They were almost an impossible nuisance and very fierce. And they came in great numbers. And they started to press up against the Germanic tribes. Now, the Germans and the Romans had been living together in somewhat peace for centuries at this point. Early on, the Germans were just basically little scattered tribes in the forest. And the Romans more or less easily could defeat them and stymie them and make alliances, and they were really no big threat to the Romans. But after dealing with the Romans for many centuries, they started to get more sophisticated. Roman agriculture spread into Germany, Towns began to emerge. Military techniques. Many of the Germans had fought in the Roman army, and they knew the techniques of the Romans. And these tribes, which had been kind of tiny, began to amalgamate. They began to come together and to form mega-tribes or confederations. And the reason they did this is, well, one, to protect themselves against the Romans, but increasingly, well, because the Huns were pushing at the back door. And so they needed to form together and get into pretty sophisticated organizations. And now, instead of fighting groups of hundreds, the Romans found themselves fighting groups of tens of thousands, as the Huns basically caused the domino effect. They pushed on the eastern tribes of the Germans, who pushed on the western tribes of the Germans, who pushed on further into the Roman Empire. And so now Rome had a massive problem of wild Germanic barbarians invading the empire, raping, pillaging, burning things down, stealing slaves, and causing all sorts of mayhem. And from the Roman perspective, it was like a game of whack-a-mole, because when you would send forces against one, another tribe would pop out on another spot and devastate some more territory. And so the 240s to the 280s was chaotic, as many major Roman towns, especially in northern Europe, were sacked by Germanic barbarians. Pretty bad. But it gets worse. Because to their east, the Romans finally found an empire that was worthy to fight them. For centuries, the Romans had kept a border with a group of people called the Parthians. But in the 220s, the Parthians were overthrown by a dynasty which became known as the Sassanids. And the Sassanids were much more aggressive and much more assertive than the Parthians had been. All right? The Sassanids were from deep in Persia. They were very Iranian in their outlook. The Parthians had more or less imitated Greek and Roman culture, but the Persians, the Sassanid Persians, were very proud of their Persian heritage. And in many ways, they looked back to the Persians of Xerxes, back to the Achaemenid dynasty. And they saw themselves as the resurrection of the Achaemenids, those Persians that we learned about way back when. And they dreamed of restoring the glories of ancient Persia. Their kings took on the title of King of Kings. They were Zoroastrian. You probably don't remember them, but we mentioned the Zoroastrians. This was an Iranian religion that saw all humanity and all reality as a battle between good and evil. And naturally, the Persians believed that they were on the side of good. They were on the side of the good god Ahura Mazda, and the Romans were on the side of evil. And so each of their victory further confirmed that. Their army was a big upgrade too. They had heavily armed horsemen, kind of almost like knights. And they had the traditional Persian infantry with bows and arrows, and the two were very effective together. And under their great leader Shapur, they began to have some real success against the Romans on their east. And so they began to attack the Eastern Roman Empire. Shapur at one point even defeated the Roman Emperor Valerian. He was captured alive. His troops were decimated. And Valerian actually spent the rest of his life as a footstool for Shapur. That's right. Shapur would use Valerian, the Roman emperor, as a stool to mount his horse. He'd have to bend over, and Shapur would jump on his back and then go up on his horse. Pretty humiliating. And then if you believe the Romans, he had Valerian stuffed and kept as a monument back in Persia. And so this was obviously very, very humiliating for the Romans. And they seemed to be unable to defeat all of these forces that were hitting them. Remember, they've got civil wars going on in this period. There's no stable emperor. The climate is turning against them. There's less food. They're dying of plague. There's less people to produce food. There's inflation. The Germans are hitting them. The Persians are hitting them. It's just a perfect storm of crap for the Romans. But it gets worse. Because well, this was all a pretty bad look for Rome. To have the Roman emperor acting as a footstool for Shapur, to have the Persians raiding at will, to have the Germanic barbarians pillaging the countryside. Clearly, Rome was in a bad way. And many locals in the provinces began to feel frustrated and began to take matters into their own hands, raising local defense forces. And these local defense forces had a pretty good track record. One of the cities in the Eastern Roman Empire was called Palmyra. And under their queen Zenobia, they had some real success against Shapur. They actually defeated him. And so successful were they that Zenobia and her son began to assert their independence from the Roman Empire. And with them, they took a large portion of the Eastern Roman Empire with them, including the rich province of Egypt. Also, to the far west and north, there was frustration with the Germanic barbarians. And so a Roman governor by the name of Postumus had some success against the Germanic barbarians, and his soldiers elevated him as the emperor of what became known as the Gallic Empire, comprising the modern-day countries of Great Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. So clearly, as the 260s and 270s came to an end, things were really, really bad for Rome. And the question was, would the empire be able to survive this? Well, you're going to have to stay tuned because we'll follow this up in our next lecture. Until then, I would like you to name and explain at least 4 reasons for the decline of the Roman Empire during the 3rd century crisis. So I'm not looking for a list again. I'm looking for you to name them and to explain them, and if at all possible, to connect them, because many of these problems are interconnected. Well, I will see you next time.